Hello, it's Kate Stillman, and welcome back to the Yoga Healer podcast. And in this next series, I'm doing a series on Ayurveda. Just what is Ayurveda? What is Vata dosha? What is Pitta dosha? What is Kapha dosha? What is the Ayurvedic diet? Can you lose weight with Ayurveda? So for those just tuning in, welcome to the show. And for those who've been around, we're doing these series in 2020. We're doing these series on just specific to topics. Last month, the topic was on stress. So if you missed the stress episodes, please go back and listen. There's a ton of hardcore Ayurveda packed in there. I'd say actually it's more of an advanced series, whereas this series, this month of Ayurveda is a little bit more on the beginner series. But those who love Ayurveda will love just tuning in and just being either reminded or even disagreeing with me. I was raised on debate. I was raised by a father who always played the devil's advocate, and there's something about testing our own thinking. So for those who are more advanced, just ask yourself, how would you define Ayurveda? What is it? What are the benefits of Ayurveda? Is it really effective? What is the translation of Ayurveda? So that's what we're going to get into today. We'll also talk a little bit about Ayurveda quizzes before we go into the doshas in the next few episodes, so that if you haven't taken a few Ayurvedic dosha quizzes, I'll give you some links in this episode so that you can do that before listening to, into the details of Vata and Pitta and Kapha. All right, so without further ado, what is Ayurveda? So AYU, which is part of that AYUR word, AYU is life. It's like when you think of biology, it's that bio part. The logi, or the study of, is the Veda part. And the Veda, when we look at the word Veda and the word Vedas, it's this deep study in all aspects. So it's looking from a holism. Whereas if we look at biology and chemistry and, in just how we break down subjects in the West, it's more of like these different segmented parts. Whereas in Ayurveda, we're looking at the study of life as a whole. We're looking at all of life. We're looking at the history of the cosmos, and we're looking at the cells within us. So the macrocosm and the microcosm. What is this life? So some people will say that word to study is more like science. So some people will say Ayurveda is the science of life. Other people will look at more of the deep, intrinsically holistic wisdom as an art and call Ayurveda the art of living. And I think all of these definitions are good and true and useful. In this series, I'll also include an interview with an expert on the history of Ayurveda, where we'll get into the origins of the Vedic tradition, the Vedic religion, the ancient Hindu scriptures, the actual 4 chief collections of the Vedas, the Rig Veda, Sama Veda, Yajur Veda, and Atharva Veda, of which Ayurveda emerged from. In some of these scriptures, this is where you get numbers like Ayurveda's 4,000 years old or thousands and thousands of years old, as we look into the origins of the text and tradition. So we'll have an expert on the show to really, someone who actually understands the different Sanskrit languages and is familiar with the original text to get into the history, because it is quite fascinating. What I want to share as we get into what is Ayurveda is a personal, just my personal journey with Ayurveda. So in my early 20s, I knew I wanted to study in depth holistic health from an Eastern perspective. And I debated a while between studying Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine. I had actually a bit of background in Chinese language. I'd lived in China. It seemed like a very natural way for me to go. But when I looked deeply into these different paths, what I found was that Ayurveda was so intrinsically languaged around the elements of nature. And not that Chinese medicine isn't, but the way that it was currently being taught in practice was just a little bit closer to the ecosystem, a little bit more ingrained in that you are the cosmos, that you are the elements, that you are these energies or these 3 forces of of nature, that all of this that's outside of you is also within you, and in understanding, right? In understanding, what happens is change, right? What happens is your own evolution, and your spiritual body starts to, or your subtle body starts to awaken, and you become more and more aware of your own capacities. And that really drew me in to Ayurveda, this path of like, you are your own healer. I'm not saying that's not the same in Chinese medicine. Like deep down, I do believe that to be true. It's just the way that it was being taught and practiced. What I found with Ayurveda was that like, wow, it just brings you right into you are nature, and how to understand on very subtle, simple levels, and also on very complex levels, what is the nature of you and what is the nature of any imbalances that you might have. So many people are familiar with Ayurveda from the concept of constitutions, what we call prakriti. And as we get into the episodes on what is Vata dosha, what is Pitta dosha, what is Kapha dosha, we'll look at those three different main differentials in the constitutions. And we'll also look at, what is Vikruti, or what is the current state, or what is currently out of balance. All those things mean Vikruti. And Vikruti is different than your Prakriti. So Prakriti is what is your unique constitution. And Vikruti is what are any imbalances that are currently arising. And the way that we talk about this in Ayurveda is based on the words of nature, is based on the words of these elements, which are concepts, right? So the elements are not like periodic table elements. These elements are concepts themselves. So we have in Ayurveda, as we do in really any holistic medicine, any holistic healing system across time. If we go back to indigenous medicine, what we find is the language of nature. And Ayurveda is no different than that. Where Ayurveda to me is maybe has a slight edge, or is really super fascinating, is because it was so deeply tied to yoga, to the path of enlightenment, not just the path of like spirituality and awakening, but the path of what is your true nature? Like what is you? What are you as a fully awakened human being? And many people will say that Ayurveda and yoga are different sides of the same coin. And yoga is this path of enlightenment, and Ayurveda is this path of longevity, right? How do you live optimally for as long as you can and become as awake as you can? You've got the whole coin right there. So for me, when I was first embarking on my Ayurvedic journey, I had already been into like holistic health for close to a decade. I had been, shifting my diet, eating a more plant-based diet. I had been dabbling a bit in meditation. I'm 46 now, so back in the day, this stuff wasn't nearly as popular as the standard American diet. And what really pulled me into Ayurveda was the sense that you could heal yourself through understanding your true nature. That you could heal yourself through understanding your Prakriti and your Vikruti, through understanding your constitution and understanding the current situation of imbalances. And that the guidance of a practitioner, just like the guidance of a guru, was more to help point out your true nature. But essentially, you were the one doing the work. So it was absolutely the opposite of Western medicine or allopathy. It was the opposite of, here's the expert. They'll diagnose you, tell you what's wrong with you, and give you a pill and a bill. And that had very much been my experience growing up. I had migraines, I had allergies, I had a lot of sports-related injuries growing up. I was in and out of doctors' offices all the time, all allopathic, none holistic. And I really just had no idea how to interpret the symptoms that my body was giving me. And even the subtler symptoms, the ones that weren't quite the headache, but maybe slight signs of dehydration, maybe the signs of constipation, maybe the signs of, tongue coating, the signs of the luster of my skin being less than shiny and happy, right? The signs of the emotional body, how to read my emotions, how to understand the levels and layers of self in terms of the energy body, in terms of the intuitive body. None of that. I had none of that. And I'm sure many of you who are attracted to this series on Ayurveda or attracted to this podcast have come from a similar background where like you didn't get your basic operating system in terms of holistic thrive and how to be your own self-healer. Like that might not have been part of how you were raised, how to optimize mind, body, spirit into action and be the best you can be, both physically and mentally and relationally and spiritually. Right? So if you missed that memo, like I did, what happens is you find yourself attracted to not just the wholeness, the whole systemness, the holistic nature of Ayurveda, but you find yourself attracted to the personal empowerment of the healing journey that is also part and parcel of Ayurveda. It's also a huge component of yoga that we study the self, right? Svadhyaya is the term of self-study. Svadhyaya is a huge part of Ayurveda. And the way we start to study the self is with these forces, the 3 doshas, is with the 5 elements, and with the 20 gunas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what this is, because now we're getting into what is the language of Ayurveda, right? How do we understand what Ayurveda is from the language itself? Because you can't get into Ayurveda too deeply before you start talking about these doshas and you start talking about these constitutions, the prakruti, the current state, the vikruti. And soon you'll hear words also like ama, which is that which is undigested. Some of these concepts have parallels in allopathy and Western science and Western thought, and some don't. Like ama doesn't have a direct parallel. We don't have good language for it. But the 3 forces we do, the force of vata, this is the force of movement expanding in space, where time and space become synonymous. Time is the distance traveled across space, and space is constantly expanding. And this is the concept of vata. And we'll get much more into that in the What is Vata Dosha episode. So vata is the energy of catabolism. It's the energy of dispersion, right? Where something that's potent becomes something that's more dispersed. Pitta is the second energy. It's the energy of fire and water combined into a force of metabolism. Just think about it, like in your digestive tract, you can't just have fire burning. It needs water. It needs the safety of water, right, to actually contain it. Otherwise, you get something like an ulcer or ulcerative colitis when the fire is out of balance with the water. So this is the force of metabolism, is the force of Pitta. Now, Kapha is the force of water and earth combined, mostly water, this force of regeneration, of rejuvenation, of nourishing and flourishing. This is the energy of Kapha. It's the energy of building, or what we would say is anabolism in Western medicine. So you have catabolism, metabolism, and anabolism. And these 3 energies are these 3 forces, and they're in dynamic harmony when you're healthy and thriving. And when one goes higher than the other, like when one goes out of balance, what that usually means is that it's out of sync with the other 2 energies. It's now in a state of dis-ease. And that's really what we are talking about when we're talking about vikruti, is like, what is the current state of imbalance? Now, what's tricky, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ayurvedic quizzes. And what's a little tricky on the Ayurvedic quizzes, and this is where having a practitioner or studying in the Living Ayurveda course with me is really super helpful, is often we can't answer the questions accurately, right? So say we're overweight and depressed, we might assume we're kapha, because kaphas look like they have a bulkier body and their emotions are heavy and dense. But if you're overweight, that is actually a dis-ease of kapha, right? It's in the vikruti part. It doesn't mean that your constitution, your prakruti, is kapha. You can, and actually I have some episodes on this that I'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about can you lose weight with Ayurveda, when we do that podcast and I talk about overweight vatas versus overweight pittas versus overweight kaphas. My point being this, I want you to take a number of different quizzes to start to see what are the tendencies. And when you answer those questions in those Ayurvedic quizzes, what I want you to ask yourself is, when I'm happy and healthy and thriving, what is my nature? What am I more like? Am I more like this, or am I more like that, or am I more like the other one? And this is really important because when you understand Prakriti, you actually are tapping into how these energies that create your constitution, how they're meant to be within you, like how you're meant to thrive. So when I started taking Ayurvedic quizzes, I had this preference. I wanted to be more Vata than I was. It was part of this skinny society preference. And I would take these quizzes and I'd be like, wow, my mind is really Pitta. It's really fiery. It has these energies of intensity and sharpness. Pitta types, often Ayurvedic practitioner types will say oh, Pittas always think they're right. And I remembered growing up, my siblings would say, oh, Katie thinks she's always right, all the time. And it was true. And I think it still is to some degree. It's definitely been my downfall. Right. And so Pitta's type mentally tend to be cocky. They tend to be hyper confident, assertive, dominant, all of these things. And so when I was reading about it, that was really true. But when I looked at my physical body, it wasn't really that Pitta. So a lot of the answers to the questions in the Ayurvedic dosha quiz for me would come up kapha, that I would have a harder time losing weight than gaining weight. I was had strong endurance. I was naturally sturdy. I naturally could go a while without eating. These are all tendencies of kapha, even physical tendencies of I have thick hair. I have a strong, sturdy bone structure. Some of my physical tendencies were also a bit on the pitta side. I'm not super voluptuous like some kaphas. I'm just sturdy, a little bit on the earthy side of kapha, less on the watery side. So as you're asking, what is Ayurveda? It's really a path of who are you? And what is this life? And what is this cosmos that I was born into? And can I know it from a sense of the energies, the forces? Can I know it from a sense of the elements? Can I awaken who I am by understanding the 5 elements that are all part of me, the 3 doshas that are all part of me, all active in every cell are 5 elements and 3 doshas? What is more dominant though in me? What are the components of these elements and forces that have a little bit more than less than in me? Because that is my constitution. And then what is the nature of the imbalances that I currently have? So if I'm currently overwhelmed and scattered, that's a sign that Vata is in a Vikruti state, as Vata is out of balance. I was just talking with a friend who's he's the head of the ski patrol at our local mountain. And he was like, oh, I get so skinny this time of year. So his body has a hard time maintaining weight because his energy is dispersing because he's outside in winter. I don't even know how many hours a day. My guess is 10. And it's a blizzard often, right? So his body is constantly trying to build energy, but it's in a state of dispersion. So he has a tendency towards a Vata imbalance in the winter. He gets skinny, he loses his appetite. Those are typical Vata imbalances. What I hope to excite in you in this show is that you can know the intimacy of yourself, of your unique constitution, your unique Prakriti, both in the Manas Prakriti and your mental Prakriti, and also in your dosha Prakriti, or your bodily constitution. This question of is Ayurveda really effective? So part of the way we went about organizing this podcast series was what are people actually searching for in Google? And one of the questions was, is Ayurveda really effective? And the way I want to talk about this is not just in terms of who you are in terms of your constitution, but to actually back up a step to what do we all have in common as human beings? If we look into Ayurveda as the study of the cosmos, the study of life over time, and then the study of you fit into obviously a much larger spectrum of human beings. And if we look at human beings as primates on planet Earth, how we evolved with this planet, right? We evolved with the elements of this planet, the earth, the concept of solidity, of the nourishment of the soil, right? Structure, stability, groundedness, the concept of water, which is cohesion and fluidity and support, the concept of fire, which is transformation, which is light, which is directionality, the concept of air, which is movement, coordination, the concept of ether, which is expansion into pure potentiality, into deep space, right? We have these 5 concepts and these 3 energies, which are amalgams of these elements. So we have the force of Vata, the force of Pitta, the force of Kapha that we already talked about, that these are moving through our day and night cycle. And that these forces are stronger during different times of day than others. And so much of Ayurveda, much of the modern wisdom of understanding preventative medicine and how that taps into this ancient wisdom is we get all these little cues from modern medicine and circadian rhythm. And when we look back into Ayurveda, what we find is that the simple dinacharya, the simply daily cycle, aligning to the daily rhythm of the energies, is that the daily habits of Ayurveda prescribed in these ancient scriptures, that these daily habits are in sync with the natural energies that are arising. So what you do when matters. It's not just what you do matters, it's when you do it. So when you sleep matters, when you eat matters, when you poop matters, when you meditate matters, when you socialize matters, when you do deep concentrated work. All of this can be much more deeply aligned. When you're aligned to the energies and the rhythms of the cosmos, you live your life in aligned. So much to me of Ayurveda is actually aligned to action. You know yourself, you know this cosmos, and soon you start to line these 2 things up and take aligned action. And when you do, you experience ease. When you do, you experience flow. You experience a state of higher consciousness. You experience the ability to do more and to be more. And when you do, you experience what it's like to be in sync, right? And so when we look at what is disease from an Ayurvedic perspective, so much of what I see it as is what is out of sync. How is the nature of the cosmos and your nature not lined up? Like not lined up for aligned action. So the question of, is Ayurveda effective? Well, of course it's effective to line up. And this is where we see massive breakthroughs as people start to understand themselves, right? Ayu, life, Veda, to study. What is this life? Who am I? What is the cosmos? If I can start to understand it. And these words in Sanskrit, the Vata, Pitta, Kapha, there's a zillion words in Sanskrit with Ayurveda. And there's a level of complexity and there's a level of transmission in understanding the Sanskrit. But for those of you who don't really want to go there, just what is your experience of earth? What is your experience of sky or the heavens? What is your experience of water, of fire? What is your experience of air or wind? Like, where are you in your experience of nature? And if you find like, I'm really super disconnected from nature, then that's really where the path of Ayurveda begins. It's like, let's get you back connected to that you're a human being that evolved on this planet. And then you have this ancient history. You have all of the physical bodies that came before the human body that also were part of the mammals, that also aligned to the day-night cycle. And some mammals didn't, like your cat did not. Your cat is nocturnal, right? But as a primate, what is the history of primates with these energies? And what we find is that these rhythms of going to bed early, going to sleep soon after it gets dark, waking up before the dawn, eating only during daylight hours, these very basic principles, hydrating and pooping upon arising in the morning so that you don't carry waste into the day, allowing time for meal spacing so that your digestion can rest, so that you can go into deeper levels of absorption and energy efficiency. Now in the modern era called intermittent fasting, right? That these are all part of the basic teachings of Ayurveda. Also part of the basic teachings of Ayurveda are the stages of life from preconception through death. Like they go way, way into your early phases, like your pre-cellular life in terms of the energies and the prakruti and vikruti of your parents. Right? What were the cells that created your first cell? And then what changes in these energies and these different stages of life? Kapha stage of life is conception through childhood. Pitta stage of life is the teen years, early adulthood through full maturation and life purpose work. Vata stage of life is the elderly phase of life, which is becoming longer and longer. And how do we understand how to align to these energies so that we can thrive in any stage of life, knowing that childhood has more mucus-related imbalances, knowing that adulthood has more pitta or fire-related, inflammation-related imbalances, knowing that the elderly phase of life has imbalances that are more due to deep cellular dehydration and dryness. And how, through knowing this, can we actually mitigate? How can we make better choices to counteract the current tendencies? And that's where the healing phase of Ayurveda is all about. Is you start to understand what are the energies that are dominant, that are creating imbalances. How can you then make better choices to cultivate the opposite energies, to experience the amelioration of imbalances? And the beginning path to that is the gunas. I mentioned that term earlier in the episode. And all a guna means is the adjectives. So I look at the doshas, vata, pitta, kapha, of those forces. Those are verbs. The 5 elements, earth, water, fire, air, ether, those are nouns. And then the 20 gunas, is it hot or is it cold? Is it heavy or is it light? Is it moist or is it dry? Is it sharp or is it soft? Is it rough or is it oily or smooth? These are the descriptors. These are the gunas, the characteristics, the adjectives. So we have the doshas are verbs, we have the elements are nouns, and then we have the characteristics are the adjectives. And this is the most basic language of Ayurveda. So say, for instance, my child comes home from a gymnastics meet and she sounds stuffy and she's clogged up, and I look at her tongue and it looks heavy, like there's a thick coating of mucus, and she seems lethargic, right? I know that there's imbalances that look like kapha, that look like water and earth related imbalances, the imbalances of excess moisture, right? And I can hear it in her sinuses, I can see it on her tongue. But then if I look back into preceding actions, I can say, well, has her energy been more dispersed? Has she been more overscheduled? Has she been out of the house more than in the house? Out of the home versus in the home. And if that's true, then I know that vata, the energy of dispersion, right, the catabolism, the catabolic energy, is dominant. So she has kapha, but underneath that kapha imbalance is a vata imbalance. And this is how Ayurveda, it seems really simple, but the more you understand it, you're able to read this stuff just intuitively, intrinsically. Okay, she needs to be more in the home, and we need to promote the digestion of the mucus, maybe some hot ginger tea, maybe cutting down on sweet taste and amplifying more of the taste of pungent and astringent, which might look like she likes carrot curry coconut soup. So that might be a better choice, right? In the next day or two. Like, how do we transition her diet more towards these tastes which will dissolve the mucus? But then underneath all that, right, she needs to be home before she really gets sick, right? We need to get her home. So I might do very simple vata pacifying practices, like have her we have a steam shower. If you have a bathtub, like have them take a hot bath and rub oil on their bodies. And I'll still do this. She's going on 12. I'll still do this for her. Like rub as much oil into her body. Get that grounding, home, mama-infused energy into her cells. So the question of, is Ayurveda effective? I mean, ask anyone who understands it and just notice the transmission. Because what happened when I started studying Ayurveda was that I started to know myself. I started to be able to heal diseases, go on a deep healing journey. I got rid of my migraines. I got rid of my allergies. I got rid of excess weight. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But more than that, I got rid of self-loathing, typical like modern Western female Gen X self-loathing, like raised in a culture that didn't accept my body, that made fun of my body. I was able to digest that and process that. And this is, to me, so much of what Ayurveda is it brings you home to you. It brings you home to the cosmos that created you. It gives you the language to understand who you are and what is this life. All right, so that's just a brief introduction to what is Ayurveda. I want you to take some dosha quizzes. My favorite one is at yogahealer.com/DOSHA, dosha. You'll see that it's hosted by Banyan Botanicals. And it's my favorite because it really helps you get into both the Prakruti and the Vikruti. So that's where I'm going to leave you. And in the next episode, we'll get into what is Vata dosha. And the one after that, what is Pitta dosha? And then the one after that, what is Kapha dosha? So you can start to understand. I recommend listening to all of them, regardless of what your constitution is, because the whole idea is like you need to understand all of the forces. You need to understand all 5 of the elements. And eventually, you'll figure out the language of all 20 of the gunas, and that'll give you the structure of understanding what is Ayurveda. All right, and for those who really want to study Ayurveda, that's why we teach I teach the Living Ayurveda course. I've taught it every year since 2007, and there's never been a better time to actually enroll in it because you'll get right into our prep work for that. You'll get into the Yogi Detox. You'll get into Body Thrive for a full half year before Living Ayurveda actually begins, so you get grounded in Dinacharya. To learn more about that, go to yogahealer.com/AYURVEDA. All right. On with the show. Again, this has been Kate Stillman with yogahealer.com.